She was sent as a joke, a fairy queen, humiliated and forgotten in a distant colony. He seemed like just an ordinary mechanic, but the universe didn't know. The man who offered her coffee had once ruled entire star systems. And when they fell in love, two realities decided to erase them from history. They did not send her as a gift. They sent her as an apology folded into contempt, a glittering slight meant to humiliate a court the way a courtesan might be offered to a rival, ornate, useless, and obvious. The diplomatic vessel that carried her cleaved the amber sky like a fingernail through honey. Its hull threw down holographic ribbons of imperial courtesy that wound uselessly around the colony's low roofs. Rain fell in flat sheets of methane and light, booming on corrugated metal, turning the world into a wash of gold and oil. Where the ship's ramp touched ground, guardians in ceremonial black stepped aside, and a single laugh rode the wind, sharp, public. Eilina stepped out as if stepping from a stage. She wore a dress threaded with luminescent fungi and spun glass, sleeves that shivered like moth wings, a crown of filigree that tinkled when she breathed. The colony's children, wide-eyed, reached toward her without knowing they were part of someone else's mockery. Officials murmured formulas of insult dressed in protocol. Their voices said, "A token of our goodwill." Behind the smile she was supposed to offer stood every courtier's enjoyment, the amusement of an empire that pleased itself by turning living people into jokes. She had been sent to Vela's Reach not for exile, properly speaking, but for performance. Her family had thought to quiet her eccentricities, her penchant for tinkering with machines in royal chambers, for arguing in the starlit halls that a relay could think, by shipping her to a place nobody important cared for. The message was clear: be a story there, not a threat here. The workshop that became her wharf smelled of oil and citrus cleaner. It was a narrow room built under the colony's main ridge, its windows facing the amber horizon so that every storm staged the sea as a backdrop. Machines hummed like sleeping beasts. Tools lived in organized chaos. A clockwork radiator ticked with a sound like a heart trying to be brave. Humiliation is a slow thing. It arrives in private and grows like rust. The initial laughter on the dock flared into comments in the chow hall. Does the queen do anything besides wear those lights? They called her a fairy because her garments were other, because the cut of her hand suggested something that belonged to moonlight rather than the human world. They called her that as if it were an insult. She learned to eat small, to let the courtesies fall away like petals. She learned how to fold herself into a chair and be, conspicuously, less. What they could not take was the way her fingertips knew the geometry of a relay board. She had been taught the language of currents and feedback loops as a child, not for profit, but because she had insisted that stars were made of equations as much as of myth. Her mind catalogued faults the way the moths catalogued the dark. She could look at a diagnostic readout and hear a story where a relay had been struck, what stress had traveled down a filament 3 months before. Skill is the antidote to mockery, and it shows in small commandments: a soldering iron held at a confident angle, grease on wrist where royalty never liked it to be. He met her in the shadow of a radiator. Corin, he gave her that name in casual speech, a small, blunt thing that felt like a slate rubbed with oil, was a mechanic in the colony's maintenance collective. He wore patchwork sleeves sewn from old flight suits, hair cropped in practical planes, and hands that were always impossibly steady. He had a laugh that was the opposite of performance, rare, surprised, and private. He offered no titles and carried no ceremony. He offered coffee, an acid black thing brewed from the colony's scavenged beans, and a place to put her hands when they both bent over a broken scanner. First impressions matter more than protests. Corin watched as she stripped a diagnostic scanner to its bones under the soft wash of the workshop's lamp, his eyes tracing the rhythm of her movements, cataloging where she hesitated and where she moved with surety. He didn't laugh when she talked about harmonics and phase drift as if he were not conversationally fluent in a language of old industry. When a spark leaped dangerously from a live node, he already had his hand under the socket, steady, and his voice said, not in commands, but in simple fact, "Don't trust the outer ring. Its insulation picks up charge when the rain begins." "There is a theory," she said later, while they measured a residual current with an improvised probe, "that machinery is shy. It admits only those who whisper the right way." Corin smiled. "Or it respects hands that don't flinch." Their first nights were small and not especially romantic. They overlapped schedules like fixtures in a clock. She worked the late-watch diagnostics because the colony's schedule still assumed a human circadian rhythm, and she had no intention of playing a role in someone else's calendar. He worked the grinder and the relays because mechanicians were needed at all hours. They shared repairs, a small rapprochement over stripped bolts, and the exact temperature at which a thermal buffer would warp. She taught him to read the fine lines of relay fatigue that the colony's technicians missed. He taught her where the best screws were kept and which coffee would be warmest when stolen from the communal pot before dawn. While her arrival had been theater, the relay demanded something else, labor that couldn't be dressed up and that refused to look at gowns. They stood in the belly of the array when the auroral currents came in, and rust came off their fingers like confession. Eliana read the array as if listening to a choir, detecting harmonics where others heard noise. Corin held the bridge lids open, handed her the right tool before she asked, and occasionally hummed low notes that matched the frequency of the array so their work became choreography. When she called herself a fairy with a half-smile in the mess hall, it was not mockery but an acceptance. "Let them call me that if they must," she said. "I am tired of court dances. I will dance with copper and charge and call it my own." If the colony had been a stage, their labor made it real. People began to see the Queen as a person in a way that the court never had. Being seen was less spectacular and more dangerous. It requires you to change the way you move through the world, less performance, more honesty. She learned to hold a solder through the storm, to whisper to a misaligned node the way one might whisper to a frightened animal. When a technician tried to take credit for something she had done, Corin corrected him not with venom, but with exactitude. No, that was Eliana's rephasing. The waveform shows her modulation. This is the place kinship grows, in being named, in being attended to with the correct vocabulary. Foreshadowing, if you look for such things, is built from the small fractures of habit. Corin had tics that did not match the colony's idioms. He listened to imperial statics with a patience that passed into reverence, and when the main line from the capital jittered, he would sit unmoving until the broadcast folded into sense, and he would know exactly which subsidiary filters to open. He spoke sometimes with a cadence that borrowed from courtly rhetoric, the rolled cadence of people raised by oratory. Once, in the middle of a long, cold night beneath the array, when their gloves were damp and the solder had congealed into gray moons, he sighed and said, as if to himself, "Protocol does not anticipate the humility of weather." Eliana raised an eyebrow. "You sound like a man who has lived with protocol." He laughed then, a brief sound, and said nothing. He wore a ring on a finger, simple, technical, a circlet of metal with a faint, iridescent vein.
When he bent to read a gauge, the ring glinted, and for a second the light caught on an emblem, an oval the shape of an old coin, insignia carved with a precision that made Eliana's throat tighten. It was the sort of small thing one would expect a court to treat as insignia for a prince, not trivially for a mechanic. She wrote none of this down. People make narratives from things like rings. She simply noticed, the way she noticed that a relay's noise changes its pitch before it fails.
Then the empire tested them, because empires tend to test what their citizens have been sent to be, a spectacle to be judged. The test came through as a cold, formal transmission, a challenge wrapped in the velvet of protocol. An imperial envoy arrived, not on an enormous cruiser, but on a smaller, glimmering vessel shaped to put itself at the same level as the colony's roofs. It was a diplomatic maneuver that smelled of arrogance. If you make someone perform humility in their own backyard, they will feel small. The envoy's message was one of the Empire's cleaner cruelties. It said, in carefully modulated tones, that Vela's Reach would host a calibration trial for a series of new standardized relays, imperial testing equipment designed not only to collect data, but to humiliate. The test was a timed sequence that would simulate orbital and atmospheric stress conditions, cascading failures staged to separate the competent from the decorative. It was a test with a purpose in the court's view, to demonstrate which outposts deserved recognition and which should be quietly folded into administrative neglect. For Eliana, the test was a trap and a stage, and also a chance. The panel would come with official observers. The Empire might, as their preferred method of gentleness, offer restoration as a prize, an offer of recognition with a leash attached. The colony could do little but accept the terms. The test was scheduled for a week out. For some, hope arrived short. For others, dread arrived early. "You could refuse to play," Governor Marek said when Eliana approached him. His hands were thick, scraped with orange paint, the hands of someone who had once been hopeful about bureaucracy. "Walk away. Ask the envoy to go to the capital and tell them where to place their pride." Eliana looked at him with a look too old for her years. "If I walk, the court's story about me continues. If I stay, I have to turn a lie into a tool." Marek grunted. "Tool-making suits you." There is a moral calculus that lives in the hands. She could be restored to her court. She could, in theory, become a figure whose eccentricities would be domesticated into acceptable pageantry. She had been given a crown once. The empire could grant another. It would come with status and the right to walk in places otherwise closed to her. But she had watched how courtly restoration tended to shape people, to make them smaller, prettier, and forgetful of how a solder melts at a certain heat. The empire offered the shape of things, not the substance. There was another calculation. Corin's face, close to the lamp while they worked, had an expression she began to read like a map. Sometimes, reading the colony's supply manifests, he would pause and go silent. Once, he traced the Empire's seal in the dust of a console with his finger and didn't seem to understand why anyone would be amused by a gala. When she asked him whether he had ever served in the capital, he said, "Once."
"For a little while." He described the city by its shadowing effects, light that fell like curtains, voices measured the way clocks measured time. She did not press him. It was not her place to pick the locks of that which others wore as a private armor. But there were moments, small linguistic habits that he carried with him that didn't belong to Vela's Reach. He had a way of ordering technicians that was not a command but a law of gravity. People lined up when he asked for a tool without considering whether they had the right. He corrected a supply manifest with the care of someone who understood the hidden economies of empire, which parcels were supposed to go to which station, which ones would be remarked to conceal theft. It was as if he had once navigated a bureaucracy that stitched influence rather than profit. The colony's testing day was a study in contained pressure. The imperial device they were to calibrate was smaller than Aliana expected, an elegant cylinder of polished composites, but it hummed with enough intelligence to be unnerving. It measured fidelity in a way that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. Not only could it track signals, but it could also simulate the directional stress of a failing orbit and the thermal creep of a summer too hot. The trial began with the ceremonial formalities of the Empire, a measured voice that read the terms, a stipulation of time, the presence of observers whose badges glinted with schematic precision. They would throw the test in a way devised to fold ordinary error into scandal. It was a cruelty that used science as a weapon, set a machine to track failure, then count human faces when it occurred. Aliana and Corin got there before dawn. The light was a liquid amber joying the horizon. Their hands were already marked with the night, fingerprints of solder and dust, the wash of rain still clinging to their sleeves. They took the device apart with the same calm confidence they used to untangle each other's small embarrassments. Corin's hands were steady, Aliana's hands were sure. The test was not designed for competence, but for spectacle. The imperial evaluators triggered cascades that would have taken months to occur in nature. The device experienced a simulated strike that dulled sensors in a sequence meant to shame technicians into admitting ignorance. Small errors were amplified, then recorded. The judges took notes like priests. Phase 1 is an attenuation of the sensor node matrix. We will observe response time. We will observe recovery methodology. The colony has 6 hours. 6 hours is a long time when the world is watching. It is an expanse that invites confession in 2 directions. People either crack or they find ingenuity. Aliana breathed, felt the weight of everyone's expectation in the box of her chest, and then she said simply, "Give me the readout." They had a plan. It was not theatrical, but it was precise. She and Corin split the device's logic according to a rhythm that made sense only to people who had learned to repair things that had forgotten why they were there. She fed the device a countersignal that mimicked the relay's signature and thus began a conversation with the machine that was equal parts coaxing and technical firmness. Corin fed her the right connector and held the buffer in place when the initial surge spit molten metal. Their motions folded into each other, hands passing tools, eyes checking gauges, until the device belched and then hummed an uncertain tune. Halfway through, when the judges shifted in their seats and the cameras leaned forward as if seeking scandal, Aliana paused and looked directly at the lead observer. His face was a flat protocol. "You are trying to make us look foolish," she said. Her voice did not rise, but it carried. "We will not perform your farce." It was, she knew perfectly well, a risky thing to say. The Empire's officials liked spectacle when it belonged to them. They liked outcomes that mirrored their expectations. But she had ceased to care whether the world preferred her smallness. She had begun to prefer being recognized by truth. Their solution was not miraculous. It was a labor of affectionate cruelty. Where the imperial device simulated catastrophe by abusing a set of redundant nodes, Aliana mapped the false patterns and rewired the diagnostics so the relay rejected the simulated disturbance as if it were an anomaly in a weather report. Corin redesigned a thermal bleed that would have stressed the device's casing, replacing a brittle polymer with a composite scavenged from a refitted hull plate. People work miracles every day in colonies. They merely call them repairs. When the device came back to life, it did so quietly, like a heart realizing it had a will to continue.
The judges stared at their readouts. The lead observer's lips made a thin line. The recorded data showed a recovery pattern that should have been impossible in a purely simulated cascade. "How did you do this?" he demanded, not in curiosity, but in command. Aliana felt the warmth of being seen in that moment, true, hard recognition that belonged to the space where competence meets necessity and says simply, "I did this." She answered, to the point, without the lilt of courtly irony. "We read your simulation as if it were a language. We responded in kind." In the days that followed the trial's aftermath, whispers traveled through the colony like warming streams. Some were celebratory. The Queen fixed what others could not. And some were skeptical. They must have been helped by someone from the capital. Rumors are a colony's undercurrent, and they swell when something unusual happens. But the victory did not simply earn them applause. It earned attention. The Imperial Observer's reports were a wound translated into a bullet. They sent the colony a formal commendation, veiled as an inquiry, a message that said politely that the achievement had not gone unnoticed and that further consideration would be given. Embedded in that consideration was an offer shaped by the Empire's ancient grammar, an invitation to reintegration, to recognition, and to the possibility of returning to the capital, of joining the list that mattered. Coring read the message before she did. He turned the hollow between his fingers as if disliking the message's holographic sheen. When Aliana came into the common room, bringing with her the smell of rain and solder, he had a look in his eyes that was not the usual calm. "They want you to attend a reception in the capital," he said. "They are offering certain elevations." The sentence hung between them like a structural beam. "Elevations," she repeated. Translation, crowns, or a new costume. He watched her, and for the first time their work face shifted into something private. "If you go, you will be placed back where they can look at you and license your oddities," he said. "If you stay, you keep the things you have earned." It was a fissure dressed as a question. Aliana felt the old tug of court gravity, the torque of status that had heretofore bound her family and her options. The imperial offer was more than vanity. It had weight, access to better tools, to a library of designs that had been kept in vaults, to the softening of bureaucratic antagonism that makes life materially easier. It also had strings. The Empire did not give what it did not intend to hold. Restitution would be conditional on her conformity to spectacle. Her eccentricity would be marketable at best, and at worst she would be remade into someone who existed to entertain. She thought of the communities that had knuckled under imperial patronage and lost their autonomy. She thought of children in the colony who now looked to her as proof that one did not need imperial permission to keep one's hands honest. She thought of Corin's steady eyes and the way the ring on his hand caught light like a hidden star. "Go," he said at last. The single word was not command. It was the gift of choice, offered with a simplicity that made it both easy and impossible to accept. "No," she said, and the word was a small thunder. She did not say it because of bravado. She said it because she had sat in the belly of a relay and listened to its rhythms, and because she had learned what being seen meant. "If I go, I will be someone else's story again. If I stay, I will be what I am here." The colony's nights hummed as if the world itself were thinking. She imagined, not without sorrow, what leaving would look like. A staged return, a smile measured and retooled, an existence where coffee tasted like obligation. She imagined the quiet life she could have here, faulty relays that would be repaired, children who would learn how to solder, a home that would be built from cinder blocks and kindness. Corin's expression did not change much. His hands folded like hands that had learned restraint. "If you choose to stay," he said, "know there will be costs. Not only will the capital not like your refusal, it may speak of it. The empire measures offenses in time and favors." They did not know in that room what those costs would be. They could not have measured the asymmetry that would later press into their futures, that lifespans in the empire and the colony did not map one to one, that choices made in small rooms echo in corridors of power with a weight that can bend life. But their choice in that moment was not a legal response, it was a moral geometry. She chose to be present to what she had made, to the people who had given her a name without irony. She chose, in that night, to sit with Corin under the lamp and tell him the story of a relay board and the way the array learned to sing again. They drank bad coffee and laughed at the idea of crowns. The first time, in the months after the trial, that Aliana saw a slip of the emperor in Corin's habits, she tacked it to the world like a curiosity rather than a betrayal. He fumbled with social etiquette in ways that made him human. He apologized for taking up space. He blushed when praised. But there were times when habit lay across his face like a shadow. Once, when a maintenance officer insubordinately diverted a parcel that had been reserved for the colony's med unit, Corin called down the man with an imperiousness that startled the boy. "Return that manifest now," he said, in a voice that carried the memory of court decisions. The boy complied, as if encountering law. When Aliana asked him, in a corridor splashed with rain, whether he had ever been an envoy, he said, "No, I have connections." When she laughed at his evasiveness, he touched the ring and said, "I was never the person I was supposed to be." She let it lie. There is a thing that happens when people love. They collect the soft contradictions of one another and make a home of them. Corin's contradictions fit into the places in her designs where she had always wanted a human warmth rather than a protocol. His ring, when it glinted, looked less like an insignia and more like evidence of someone who had chosen to be small for a reason. News of the trial traveled in official dispatches and backwater whispers. The colony's radios carried imperial signals, messages that folded back into data that would one day be read by hands not their own. Every message from the capital felt like a ripple toward something inevitable. Some mornings, Aliana woke thinking that the empire would be bored and go back to its rituals. Other mornings, dread ate at her like a rust that could not be cleaned off with solvent.
One evening, a week after the trial, the main array threw a warning, an unprogrammed jump in background noise that suggested an approaching thermal storm and a sudden rise in particle flux. These were the kinds of things that the Empire used to measure out disasters, as if testing people's capacity for endurance. The colony scurried. Children were brought into communal shelters. The radiator complained in unfamiliar keys. Aliana and Corin went to the array and worked like the people they had become. Under the amber rain, they bent over a console that painted their faces in warm gold. The wind sang against metal, and the air tasted like old copper. The device that had been fixed weeks before now presented a problem that required not only skill, but the appetite to risk being wrong in public. They could have called in an external team, but the Imperial Tempest had closed the lanes, and the colony's only window to the capital would be a slow, bureaucratic route, the kind that would turn a small problem into a preventable catastrophe. They chose, again, to rely on what they were, two people who had learned to craft truth out of worn tools. The repair required them to dance along the edge of danger. A mis-soldered joint would leak current. Too tight a thermal contraction would shear a fiber.
They argued softly over technique, the way partners argue over the best way to lift a child. When a panel jammed, Corin reached under with a hand that had the memory of imperial cuisine, delicate but sure, and Ileana felt the thrill that comes from hands that know how to protect someone without making a show of it. When their fingers met on a brittle screw, neither withdrew. There are moments in the hush of technical focus where consent and desire sit in the same chair. Their closeness was necessary and tender. The storm passed after hours of stubborn labor. The array sang again, not with the flawless note of a machine in a museum, but with the rough, humanized chord of something that had been saved by hands rather than ritual. The colony surprised itself by cheering, not because a spectacle had been gifted to them, but because real work had been done and real people had not failed. That night she walked with Corin across the ridge to the place where the colony's lights smudged against the amber horizon. The rain had left the world varnished, the air was cold and tasted like metal and possibility. They stood shoulder to shoulder and watched the distant shine of the diplomatic vessel as it departed, its underside glimmering like a wound. "Do you ever regret being the thing you are?" he asked, speaking into the horizon rather than at her. The voice was soft enough that the wind could have stolen it. "Sometimes," she said, "but mostly I regret the things I never tried. The court has lists for people like me, pet names and exhibitions. Here my mistakes mean something. They cost, yes, but they teach, and I prefer to be taught." Corin didn't answer at once. He reached up and took off his ring, setting it between them on the low stone. The metal looked simple in the dark, a band like any other, but when the lamplight caught it, a vein of iridescence winked as if signaling in some private frequency. "If this ring belonged to the man I used to be," he said carefully, "it would be natural for me to ask you to choose carefully. But I'm not the man I used to be." Aliama laughed, low and incredulous. "You are impossible," she said. "You are both modest enough to drink burnt coffee and proud enough to hide an entire biography under your sleeve." He shrugged. "I learned how to pretend to be modest. Pretending is a kind of courtesy." They leaned then, as if to rest. The colonists' lights flickered behind them. The diplomatic ship disappeared beyond the horizon like a good dream. In the silence, their hands found each other, and for a moment the world contracted to the warm fit of fingers that matched. If the universe had been a court, it might have saved the final remark for some other time. But worlds are impatient. The Empire had noticed. The message that arrived at dawn, folded into salt air and formal tone, was not merely a commendation, it was a communication that implied an expectation. It hinted at a reconciliation built on terms that were thinly veiled commands. It promised recognition and the return of status, and it named, not as an accusation, but as a fact, that Aliana's success disrupted certain plans. They read the message together. Corin held the holo between them and traced the lines of protocol with a finger. "They say," he read aloud, "that an exemplary citizen has demonstrated capabilities deserving of further cultivation. The capital extends an invitation." There was a pause where history sat like a soft animal. In that pause, the colony's future, her own future, and the quiet gravity of their evenings together all trembled on a hinge. She thought of the ring left on the stone. She thought of the way he had once spoken of being someone else, and how such confessions sit like loose threads at the edges of a tapestry. She thought of what it meant to be offered something you did not want because it would make you famous in a way that would cost you the people who had seen you first. They both knew this much. Choices given in the light of dawn are rarely clean. The Empire's invitation would not simply reward competence, it would recatalogue her. It would place her in a record, a ledger where deeds are owned by crown and subject. Choosing to accept would grant her access to everything the capital could melt for her, but at a cost measured in small, inevitable erasures. When the morning pressed its cold hand against their faces, Aliana slid her fingers into Corin's and squeezed once, a small signal of alliance. "We will decide when we are not being watched," she said. He nodded, but his eyes were the color of a thing remembering itself.
The ring at the place where a hand had once been set flashed. The choice loomed like a storm over an island, inevitable and distant at once. They had saved the relay. They had saved the colony's season. They had, in the process, made an imperial bureaucracy curious, and curiosity in the hands of empires is a complicated instrument. It seeks to order, to collect, to place trophies on mantles. Eliana walked back to the workshop and sat at the bench where she had first stripped the scanner down to its bones. Her hands found their tools as if finding old friends. She let the work speak back to her the way it always had, a language of torque and heat and the slow intelligence of things mending. Outside, the colony breathed and went about its business. The diplomatic envoy's messages sat like sequined scraps in a world of metal and grease. She did not yet know whether she would accept the Empire's invitation. She did not yet know if the man who wore Corin's name would, in some inevitable hour, fold back into the identity that his ring implied. What she did know, the truth that had become a kind of muscle inside her, was that, for the first time since she had been sent away like a story, she had a life she would be willing to defend. On the bench by the lamp, a small relay board blinked its consent in warm green. The colony outside hummed, stubbornly alive. The Empire, somewhere beyond the horizon, readied its next cordially. The next message arrived like a silken blade. An envoy, not in warship black, but in ceremonial white trimmed with ledgered brass, easing into the colony's approach with the same practiced gentleness that an empire uses to dress its intentions as generosity. They tethered near the ridge in the afternoon, their lights polite, their transmission flawless. The colony watched with an interest that carried the weight of small places. Curiosity sharpened into the particular dread and hope of people who know what happens when capitals notice. Eliana read the communiqué in the common room, her fingers wrapped around a mug that tasted faintly of scorched chicory. The message was unchanged in form from the last: commendation, invitation, a clear sentence of recompense. But this time it carried the undertone of an expectation that had been waiting in the wings. For the Empire, restoration is rarely an act of charity. It is a reordering. Corin watched her read. He did not speak when she finished, but the weather in his face shifted. It was small things that betrayed him: a tightening near the jaw, the way an old cadence hovered in his quiet, the ring catching the light and catching her eye. She had been learning to read him like she read relay noise, small syntax shifts, inflections in static. "If they come here," Governor Marek said, blunt as always, "they will bring a revenue. They will ask for the Queen to be presented, to be catalogued. They will bring more than praise." "Is that bad?"
A technician asked, as if the distinction were merely procedural. "It is what capitals are," Marek said. "They come with departments. They bring recommendations that rearrange how a town feeds itself." The colony bristled at the thought. Some pictured more supplies, better med kits, pensions for the old. Others pictured loss, a slow bureaucratic smoothing that made independence brittle. That night, after the mess hall emptied and the radio hummed the lullaby of distant traffic, Corin led Eliana to the maintenance alcove beneath the array. The alcove smelled of ozone, solder, and citrus cleaner.
He closed the hatch behind them with a careful hand and set the ring between two empty spanners on the bench. It shone like a small star fallen to earth. "Ale," he said softly, using the shortened name that felt intimate and dangerously final. "There are things I should have told you." She did not look surprised. She had been cataloging hints for weeks. Information accrues in the smallest way, the way someone orders a room, the vocabulary they use for authority, the way they listen to imperial static as if waiting for a lullaby. She had seen it all and kept it as curiosity, not allegation. Love, she was learning, is a long list of small curiosities turned commitments. "What is it?" she asked. Her hands were stained with the day's work, and she did not try to hide it. He hesitated. The shadow of the capital slid across his face in a way that none of his civilian masks ever fully banished. "I did not come here because I was uninterested in empire. I came because I needed to be someone who was not recorded. I stepped away." Stepped away. The phrase had the lean taste of a truth told carefully. He explained, in pieces, these were the acceptable things that two people who have come to trust one another can permit themselves to offer. Once he had worn robes that mapped like cartography. Once he had presided in a hall whose floors reflected constellations. Once he had been named something that required others to bend toward him. He had the voice now of someone who had laid down ceremony like an old coat. "I left because being what they wanted me to be cost me my ability to answer a simple question. Who was I when no one applauded?" His eyes held hers, steady as the warm hum of a tuned relay. "I wanted a place where I could tinker and be bad at coffee and still be myself. I did not expect to find—" He stopped, the sentence folding into a private thing. Eliana heard the confession and catalogued its edges like a technician assessing a new alloy. It fit the ring that had gleamed in the dark. It fit the manner that had carried him through officers. He had been the thing his ring implied and had chosen to be otherwise. "So you're," she let the sentence hover, "the one the Empire calls Emperor," he said, the words simple and not triumphant. "I was once in a past life with different protocols. I am not looking to reclaim it."
The ambassador's praise was elaborate and designed to inflame both pride and venality. "We see now," he said, with the slow cadence of someone reading from the scripts of empire, "that talent thrives in unexpected locales. It would please the capital to reinstate such talent and to make it a model." Eliana sat through the language as if through a formal trial, her elbows on her knees, the ring of Corin's presence a quiet counterpoint in her pocket. When the ambassador asked, in the polite way of capitals, whether she would consider attending a season in the court to demonstrate her methods, the colony held its breath. "You must understand," Governor Marek said, for the colony, his voice like an anchor thrown out in careful water. "People here depend on you in ways they did not before." The ambassador's smile was both conciliatory and interested. "Of course, and we would never remove the agency of the colony's citizens, only provide resources to allow excellence to flourish." When the envoy's representatives turned to Corin, something in his posture shifted. Habits that had been carefully buried surfaced like roots. The ambassador's glance landed on his hand and on the empty place where a ring had been. Recognition flickered, small at first, then like a lantern finding oxygen. There was no dramatic reveal in the ambassador's expression, only the cleanness of someone who registers a datum and moves on. "Is there anyone here with affiliations to the capital?" she asked. It was an innocuous question. All questions are sometimes small rifles. Corin's silence answered before he did. Words can be used like shields, but claiming nothing is an answer of its own. "Then let us be straightforward," the ambassador said, with the smooth efficiency of someone trained to remove obstacles.
The capital would like to offer a formal mediation. If the citizen accepts restoration, the capital will guarantee infrastructural support to Vela's reach and consideration for personnel. If the citizen declines, the capital will withdraw its offer, but continue to record this event as notable. The invitation was a lever. For the colony, it was either a boon or a trap. For Eliana, it was a question that tugged at every past indignity and at every found joy. For Corin, it pulled cords he had not expected to untie. Late that night, after the diplomats returned to their tether, Corin found Eliana in the workshop, fingers tracing the edges of a small repaired relay, as if memorizing its geometry through touch. "I must tell you everything," he said, finally, "not because I owe the Empire, but because I owe you the truth." He told her the parts of a life that can be told, how ascension had been a series of small pressures, how the role slowly replaced his name, how he had retreated because the life of command did not permit being human. He had felt strangled by the ceremony, by the way adjacencies ate the center. He had been compelled by an interior hunger for smallness, for mistakes that one could clean with a rag and own entirely. He had stepped aside, let the palace choose another token, and in exile had found the absurd peace of being.